There comes a time in life when you realize you've been living for everyone but yourself. For Cora Finch, that moment came at 62, staring at a computer screen in a dim motel room, at a listing for a mountain farm on sale for a single dollar. She had spent 40 years working land that would never be hers, chasing a piece of something that was always just out of reach. This property in Idaho was her last chance at something real. The barn was collapsing, the tractor was overgrown with weeds, but the land felt strangely familiar. Then she found the maps, old ledgers hidden in the barn that told a story of the former owner, a man who had vanished, and of something buried on the property worth $11 million. Now, Cora had to decide: uncover the truth or walk away from the greatest discovery of her life. Before we return, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. Cora Finch had learned early on that roots were a luxury most people couldn't afford. Her grandfather had owned a small dairy farm in western Montana, and she'd spent her childhood summers there, helping him feed the stock and mend fences. Those months were the closest thing she'd ever known to a home. When he died, the bank took the farm, and her mother moved the family to Spokane, where the work was steadier, but life felt hollow. At 18, she was picking apples in Washington. By 25, she was managing harvest crews in California. She worked vineyards in Oregon, wheat fields in the Dakotas, and cattle ranches in Wyoming. 40 years of seasonal work had given her calloused hands, a strong back, and a weathered face that looked older than her years. It had also given her something most people never acquire: the ability to step onto any piece of land and understand it. She could read the soil's composition by its color, predict the flow of water by the way the grass grew, and feel the potential in a piece of property the way some people feel an approaching storm. The work had always been enough. She saved what she could, spent little, and asked for nothing. But lately, something had shifted. Maybe it was turning 60, or maybe it was the ache in her knees in the morning. But Cora had started to feel the weight of all those years, with nothing permanent to show for them. Every farm she'd worked had belonged to someone else. Every bunkhouse had been temporary. She had been a ghost passing through other people's lives, essential but unseen. 3 months ago, she'd been managing a vineyard outside Portland for a man named Vernon Hayes. The pay was decent, the work familiar, and she thought she might stay through the winter. But Vernon's son came home from business school with ideas about efficiency and profit margins. He looked at Cora the way you look at a piece of old equipment: functional but outdated, something to be replaced by newer models. She left before he could fire her, taking her last paycheck and a sense of finality she couldn't quite name. She was staying in a motel in Hood River, trying to decide what to do next, when she stumbled on the ad. It was late, and she was scrolling through rural property websites the way some people look through old photographs, nostalgically and without real purpose. Then she saw it. Mountain farm, Idaho backcountry, asking price, $1. The listing included 3 grainy photos showing a dilapidated barn, an overgrown field, and a small farmhouse with a collapsing porch. The description was minimal: 160 acres, remote location, no utilities, buyer responsible for all repairs and back taxes. Most people would have scrolled right past, but Cora stared at the screen for a full 20 minutes, something tightening in her chest. The property felt familiar, in a way she couldn't explain. The mountains in the background reminded her of her grandfather's place. The barn had the same canted lean. Even the way the trees clustered at the edge of the property felt like something she'd seen before. She made the offer at 2 in the morning, typing a simple email saying she'd pay the $1 asking price and assume all associated costs. The reply came 8 hours later, from a law firm in Boise. The property was hers if she could wire $5,000 for back taxes and closing costs by the end of business on Friday. She did it without hesitating, draining most of her savings account and feeling simultaneously reckless and certain. The paperwork arrived by mail 3 days later. The deed listed the property as the old Hadley Place, 160 acres in Lehigh County, accessible by Forest Service Road, 12 miles outside the town of Pine Haven. The previous owner, Thomas Hadley, had bought it in 1997 and paid the taxes faithfully until 2018, when the payments stopped. The county eventually seized it for back taxes and listed it for a minimal price just to clear the books. Cora packed everything she owned into her battered duffel bag and the bed of her old Toyota pickup. 40 years of life had taught her to travel light. 3 changes of clothes, a sleeping bag, basic tools, a camp stove, and a box of books her grandfather had given her. That was the sum of her possessions. She drove east out of Oregon on a Wednesday morning in early September, watching the landscape change from green valleys to high desert and mountain forests. The drive to Pine Haven took the better part of a day. The town was smaller than she expected, maybe 800 people. One main street held a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a gas station. She stopped for supplies, stocking up on canned goods, rice, batteries, and lamp oil. The woman at the checkout counter glanced at her purchases and asked if she was going camping. Cora said something vague about staying at a place outside of town. The woman nodded, but didn't ask which one. The Forest Service Road started 2 miles north of town, marked by a faded wooden sign. It was dirt and gravel, rutted from spring runoff and narrow enough that she had to fold in her mirrors. The Toyota climbed steadily, pines closing in on both sides, the afternoon light filtering through the branches in a scattered gold. 8 miles in, she passed a mailbox with Drummond painted on the side. 10 miles in, there was nothing but forest. At mile 12, she found the turnoff. 2 wooden posts marked what had once been a driveway, now mostly overgrown with brush. She turned in carefully, branches scraping the sides of the truck, and followed the rutted track for another half-mile before the trees opened up and she saw it. The photos hadn't done it justice. The farmhouse was small and weathered, the paint long gone and the porch sagging dangerously, but the structure looked solid. It was built of logs, probably in the 1940s or 50s. The barn was larger than she'd expected, listing to one side but still standing. Beyond them, the land sloped gently up toward a line of trees, and beyond that, the mountains rose in layers of blue and gray. The late afternoon sun painted everything in an amber light. Cora sat in her truck for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, just looking. The place felt alive in a way that was hard to describe. The wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like breathing. Birds called from the tree line. Somewhere in the distance, water was running, a creek or a spring she hadn't seen yet. And underneath it all was that strange sense of familiarity, as if she'd stood here before, in another life. She finally got out, grabbing her pack and walking to the farmhouse. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly crooked on its old hinges. Inside, a thick layer of dust coated everything. The main room held a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. A doorway led to a smaller room in the back that might have been a bedroom. There was no electricity, no running water, but the bones of the place were good. The roof was sound. The windows, though grimy, were intact. That first night, she rolled her sleeping bag out on the cot, lit a kerosene lamp she'd brought, and sat at the table eating cold beans from a can. The silence was profound. No traffic sounds, no voices, no hum of machinery. Just the wind and the settling sounds of an old house. She felt something unknot in her chest, something that had been tight for longer than she could remember. She slept deeply and woke to a pale light filtering through the dirty windows. Dawn came slowly in the mountains, layer by layer. She made coffee on her camp stove and took it outside, walking the property as the sun climbed. The barn was even more decrepit up close. The roof had partially caved in, the doors hung loose, and the floor was rotted in places. But it too had a good frame. With some work, it could be saved. She was examining the barn's foundation when she heard a vehicle coming up the drive. A battered white sedan appeared, kicking up dust, and pulled to a stop near her truck. An older man got out, wearing a postal service uniform. He raised a hand in greeting and walked toward her, carrying a handful of mail. "You must be the new owner," he said, holding out the letters. "Cora Finch, right? I'm Del Patterson. I run the mail route out here." "That's me," she said, taking the mail. It was mostly junk mail, addressed to current resident. Del looked around the property with the expression of someone remembering better days. "Haven't been up this way since old Tom Hadley disappeared. Must be 7 years now. Place has gone to seed, but it's good land. Your taxes are all paid up. I just dropped them off." "Good, good." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Tom was a good man, kept to himself mostly, but he always had time for a chat when I came by. Smart fellow, a geologist or something. Then one day, he was just gone. Sheriff looked into it, but they never found a thing. Truck was still here, his personal effects, everything, like he just vanished into thin air. Cora felt a small shiver, despite the warm morning. "Does anyone know what happened?" Del shrugged. "Lots of theories, no answers. Some figure he got lost on a hike and the mountain took him. Others say he had debts or trouble he was running from. I figure a man has his reasons for the choices he makes. Still, it's a strange story." They talked for a few more minutes about mail delivery and the best route to town before Del headed back to his car. As he turned to leave, he called out the window. "Place has a strange history, Ms. Finch. But maybe that's what makes it interesting. You need anything, Pine Haven has most of it." She watched him disappear down the driveway, his words hanging in the air. A strange history. She'd felt it the moment she arrived. That sense of something unfinished, something waiting. But instead of unsettling her, it felt like an invitation. Turning back to the farm, Cora noticed the way the morning light hit the mountains, the way the shadows moved across the land. This place had chosen her as much as she had chosen it. And whatever secrets it held, whatever had happened to Thomas Hadley, she now had the time to understand. For the first time in 40 years, she had all the time in the world. By her third day on the property, Cora had settled into a routine. Wake at dawn, make coffee, walk the land to learn its rhythms. The mornings were cool enough to see her breath, but by noon the September sun was still warm. She spent the first 2 days clearing the brush around the farmhouse and assessing what was salvageable. The well still worked. She'd tested it and found the water to be cold and clear. The outhouse was in usable condition. These small victories felt like progress. The barn needed attention. It was the largest structure on the property, and it felt like it held stories in its weathered boards and deep shadows. On Wednesday morning, Cora decided to start sorting through its contents. She pulled on her work gloves, grabbed a flashlight, and pushed open the sagging doors. Inside, the barn was bigger than it looked from the outside. Shafts of sunlight cut through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in her wake. The floor was treacherous in places, rotted planks covering holes that led to darkness below. Old farm equipment lay scattered about, rusting quietly. A defunct tractor, tangles of chain, tools she couldn't identify. Old, decomposed bales of hay were stacked against the far wall. She worked methodically, stacking smaller items, salvaging scrap metal, and clearing a path, when she noticed something odd about the hay bales. The bales were stacked tight, but behind them, the back wall didn't quite line up. There was a gap, a shadow that hinted at a space beyond. Cora tugged at the nearest bale. It was lighter than it looked, mostly just dust held together by twine. She hauled 3 more away, a dry cough catching in her throat from the cloud of dust, and uncovered what the stack had been hiding. A ladder, built right into the wall, leading up to a loft that was invisible from the barn floor. The entrance had been deliberately concealed. Her pulse quickened. She tested the ladder cautiously, putting her full weight on each rung before committing to the next. The wood held. She climbed slowly, flashlight clenched between her teeth, until her head cleared the loft floor. The space was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, and the roof above it was intact. Someone had used this as a workspace or a hideaway. A wooden chest rested against the far wall. Beside it, a folding chair and a small table. Papers were spread across the tabletop, weighted down with rocks. The air smelled of old wood and something else, leather and metal. Cora pulled herself into the loft and approached the chest. It was old, well-kept cedar, with brass corners and a simple latch. She lifted the lid, half expecting it to be empty or filled with worthless junk. Instead, she found surveying equipment, a theodolite, carefully wrapped in cloth, surveyor's chains, a plumb bob, and resting on top, catching the light, a brass compass. It was beautiful, hand-etched, the kind of instrument someone cherished. She lifted it gently and turned it over. Initials were engraved on the base, followed by a date. Th. 1952. Thomas Hadley. But 1952 would have been decades before he bought this property. A family heirloom, perhaps, or something he'd found. She set the compass aside and examined the papers on the table. They were hand-drawn maps, detailed surveys of the property, showing the land from various angles. Some were clearly official, with precise measurements and dated signatures. Others were rougher, sketched quickly with handwritten notes in the margins. Several showed marked zones, small X's scattered across the property, with coordinates written beside them. In one corner, almost an afterthought, someone had written, "Primary location. Check depth soundings." Cora sat in the folding chair, spreading the maps before her, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The coordinates meant nothing to her yet, but the care taken to document them suggested they were important. And that compass, why would someone hide surveying equipment in a barn loft? She was so absorbed in the maps that she didn't hear the vehicle approach. It wasn't until she heard footsteps on the barn floor below that she realized she wasn't alone. "Hello?" a woman's voice called out, cautious but not unfriendly. "Anyone up there?" Cora quickly gathered the maps and the compass, tucked them back in the chest, and scrambled down the ladder. Below stood a woman in her 60s, holding a covered dish and looking slightly embarrassed. Oh my, you gave me a fright, the woman said, pressing a hand to her chest. I'm Faye Drummond. I live just down the mountain. I saw smoke from your chimney and thought I'd bring over a little welcome supper. Didn't mean to intrude. Cora brushed the dust from her jeans and extended a hand. Cora Finch. No intrusion at all. I appreciate the kindness. Faye looked her over with intelligent eyes, taking in the work clothes and the comfortable way Cora moved in the space. So you're really planning to stay? Most folks figured whoever bought this place would just flip it or let it fall down. I'm staying. They walked back toward the farmhouse, Faye making small talk about the weather and the trouble with the access road in winter. But Cora sensed something beneath the pleasantries. A watchfulness, perhaps. A weariness. Inside, Faye set the dish on the table. It was still warm. Chicken and biscuit casserole. That's too kind of you, Cora said. Faye waved a hand, but her expression turned serious. I knew Tom Hadley. Not well, but we were neighbors for nearly 20 years. He was a private man, but a decent one. A good neighbor. My pastor mentioned he went missing 7 years ago, come October. Faye walked to the window and looked out over the property. Sheriff looked into it, figured it was an accident, or he just walked away. But Tom wasn't the type of man to just leave. He loved this land, talked about it like it was a living thing. There was a long pause. Finally, Faye turned back to Cora, her voice lower now. If you find anything up here, anything that seems unusual, you might want to think hard about what you do with it. This property has drawn interest over the years. The kind of interest that makes people uncomfortable. What kind of interest? Corporate. Surveys, appraisals, buyout offers. Tom turned them all down flat. After he disappeared, the inquiries just stopped. She picked up her empty dish, preparing to leave. I'm probably talking out of turn, but you seem like good people, and I wouldn't want to see trouble return to this place. Cora walked her to her car, thanking her for the food and for the warning, because that's what it had been, a thinly veiled warning. After Faye drove off, she stood in the yard for a long time, looking from the barn to the mountains beyond. Back in the loft, she retrieved the brass compass and the maps, spreading them out on the farmhouse table. The coordinates were specific. The maps pinpointed locations on the property that meant something to Thomas Hadley. And now, someone was warning her about corporate interest, about letting things lie. She turned the compass over in her hands, feeling its solid weight. The needle pointed to true north, steady and sure. 1952. That date bothered her. This compass was important long before Hadley owned this land. As the evening shadows stretched across the mountains, Cora made a decision. Tomorrow, at first light, she would follow those coordinates. Whatever Thomas Hadley had been looking for, whatever had brought corporate interest to this remote piece of land, she was going to find it. Not because she was greedy or foolish, but because this was her property now. Her land, her responsibility. And because something inside her, honed by 40 years of reading the land and the weather and people, told her that understanding this mystery was the only way she would ever be truly safe here. She ate Faye's casserole as dusk settled, the brass compass beside her plate, its needle pointing steadfastly toward something she couldn't yet see, but knew was waiting. Dawn came cold and clear. Cora was up before sunrise, brewing strong coffee and studying the maps by lamplight. The first set of coordinates was marked with special emphasis, circled twice and noted as primary marker limestone outcrop. She cross-referenced it with a topographical map of the property she'd found in her truck's glove box, determining it was about a mile northeast, up the forested slope. She dressed in layers, filled a canteen, and packed a small day pack with supplies. The compass, the maps, a knife, rope, matches, and a notebook. By the time she set out, the sun was just cresting the eastern range, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The terrain grew steeper as she climbed. The pine forest gave way to older growth, massive Douglas firs and western hemlocks that blotted out much of the sky. The ground was a soft carpet of moss and fallen needles that muffled her footsteps. She hiked for 40 minutes, checking the compass regularly, adjusting her path to match the coordinates. She found the marker almost by accident. It was smaller than she expected, a brass pin driven into a limestone outcrop, nearly hidden by moss. She knelt beside it, clearing the growth away, and found numbers etched into the metal, the same coordinates from Hadley's map. But it was the hollow tree 10 feet away that caught her attention. The trunk was enormous, a cedar that must have been 300 years old, now dead but still standing. At chest height, a section of bark had fallen away, revealing a cavity inside. Cora approached cautiously and shined her flashlight into the opening. There, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled slightly as she drew it out. The oilcloth had done its job. The journal was dry and intact. She sat on the limestone ledge and carefully opened it. The first page bore a name and a date. Thomas Hadley, January 1998. The entries began simply enough. Hadley had documented buying the property and his reasons for choosing this specific location. Remote enough for privacy, he wrote, but with geological features that warrant serious study. He described himself as a retired geologist, formerly with the U.S. Geological Survey, drawn to Idaho by anomalous data he'd found in archived reports. Cora flipped through the pages, reading entries that spanned 20 years. Hadley's initial excitement was palpable. He conducted surveys, collected samples, and mapped the underground water flows. In March of 1998, he wrote, "Initial findings confirm my hypothesis. Karst topography with extensive cave structures below the surface. But the mineral composition is unusual. Trace elements of rare earths in concentrations that shouldn't naturally exist at this elevation." The journal entries became more technical. Hadley documented tests, measurements, and theories. He sent samples to university labs under assumed names, never revealing the source location. The results confirmed his suspicions. The land contained deposits of neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. Rare earth elements essential for modern electronics, defense systems, and renewable energy technology. In 2005, Hadley wrote, "Conservative estimates suggest deposits worth 8 figures at a minimum, possibly much more. But extraction would require major infrastructure. More importantly, I'm now certain these deposits are linked to the mining operation from the 1940s. I found references in the county archives to the Cascade Minerals Corporation. They abandoned this site abruptly in 1953, citing unfavorable conditions. But that makes no sense given the geological data. Men don't walk away from a fortune unless they're forced to." Later entries revealed Hadley's growing paranoia. In 2012, he noted, "Third inquiry this month from development firms. How do they know? I've been careful. Someone is monitoring property transfers, looking for specific geological markers. I need to be more careful who I trust." In 2016, he wrote, Direct approach today from Vanguard Resource Solutions. A man named Kemp, polished suit, hard questions. Offered 200,000 cash for an immediate sale. When I refused, he suggested I carefully consider my situation. What situation? This is pure intimidation. I've documented everything and stored copies off-site. If something happens to me, there's a trail. The last entry was dated September 2018. The pressure has become unbearable. Survey equipment tampered with. Mail opened and resealed. Last week, someone cut my brake lines. I only discovered it by chance. I can't involve the authorities. There's too much evidence they're compromised. I've decided on a course of action that will protect the find and may expose Vanguard's activities. This journal and all documentation that will be hidden on the property. When the time is right, I'll re-emerge. But for now, Thomas Hadley needs to disappear. Cora sat in the quiet forest for a long time after reading the words, the birds singing above her and sunlight filtering through the branches. Hadley hadn't died or run away. He had faked his own disappearance to escape corporate pressure and protect what he'd discovered. And now she was sitting here, holding his journal, with that same pressure surely about to turn on her. She walked back to the farmhouse with the journal tucked safely in her pack, her mind racing with the implications. If Hadley was right about the deposits, this property was worth far more than she paid for it. And if Vanguard Resource Solutions was willing to intimidate and threaten to acquire it, they weren't going to stop just because the property had changed hands. She made lunch and read the journal again, more carefully this time, taking notes. Hadley had been methodical. He referenced additional materials, survey reports, assay results, correspondence with Vanguard, all hidden somewhere on the property. She was lost in thought when the phone rang. The old landline that came with the house, which she'd been surprised to find, was still connected. She answered it warily. "Ms. Finch?" A professionally pleasant male voice. "This is Robert Chen from the Lemhague County Assessor's Office. I'm calling to verify some information regarding your recent property acquisition." "What kind of information?" "Just a routine check to ensure our records are correct." There was a pause. "We've had some inquiries about the property recently. Potential easement issues, considerations for public utility access. I just wanted to confirm that you are the sole owner and have no immediate plans for development or resale." The questions felt wrong, too specific, too pointed. "Who's been asking, Mr. Chen?" "Oh, just general interest. The planning department has been quiet, that sort of thing." His tone remained light, but Cora heard the evasion in it. "If you are planning any development work, you'll need to file environmental impact assessments, which can take a considerable amount of time. I just want to be sure you're aware of the regulatory landscape." "I'm aware," she said. "Thank you for the call." She hung up, a feeling of unease settling over her. She'd barely owned the property for a few days, and already people were circling. The county assessor calling with pointed questions. Hadley's warnings about corporate interest. It all confirmed what his journal had documented. That afternoon, she drove into Pine Haven and parked in front of the small public library. The building was old but well kept, smelling of aged paper and furniture polish. A young librarian directed her to the local history section, where archived newspapers and county records were kept on microfilm. She spent 3 hours searching, taking notes, and printing relevant pages. The Cascade Minerals Corporation had indeed operated in the area during the 1940s. They filed several mining claims in 1947, employing as many as 50 men. Local papers from the time ran stories about the boom, the new jobs, the economic hope for a struggling post-war community. Then, in March of 1953, a brief article. Cascade Minerals ceases operations. The company had shut down with little explanation, laid off all its workers, and transferred its claims to private ownership under circumstances the article described as unclear. There were no details about what they had been mining or why they had stopped. The property that became Hadley's farm was part of that original claim. It had passed through several owners over the decades, always sold quickly, never developed, until Hadley bought it in 1997 and started asking the right questions. Cora left the library with a folder full of copies and a dawning certainty that she was stepping into something far larger than a simple property purchase. Hadley had spent 20 years documenting a mystery that began 70 years ago. And somewhere on her land, buried beneath limestone and forest, was something valuable enough that people were willing to commit crimes to possess it. Driving up the mountain as the sun began to set, she made her decision. She would not be intimidated, and she would not back down. But she wouldn't be reckless either. Thomas Hadley had learned that lesson too late. She would not make the same mistake. Dressed in jeans, a pressed shirt, and her good boots, she wanted to look like someone who belonged, someone with legitimate business. The records office was in the courthouse basement, lit by fluorescent tubes and smelling of old paper. A clerk in his 20s barely looked up from his computer as she signed in and requested access to historical mining claims and property transfers for her specific parcel. The files came in archival boxes, organized chronologically, but dense with legal language and technical specifications. Cora spread them across a research table and began to work through them systematically, taking pictures with her phone where copying wasn't allowed. The 1947 mining claim, filed by the Cascade Minerals Corporation, was extensive. 40 pages of geological surveys, assay reports, and legal declarations. The company had identified significant mineral deposits in a 3-square-mile area, with the richest concentration on what was now her property. They had invested heavily in drilling equipment, worker housing, and processing facilities. But it was the documents from 1953 that proved most interesting. The claim abandonment paperwork was cursory, citing only unfavorable economic conditions. Tucked inside it, however, was something unusual. A legal declaration signed by a federal surveyor, stating that certain findings from the site were classified under national security protocols and would remain sealed for 50 years. 50 years from 1953. That meant the records should have been unsealed in 2003. Cora specifically requested those files. The clerk disappeared into the archives, returning 20 minutes later with a thin folder marked Cascade Minerals, Declassified, 2003. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a memo from the Department of Defense dated February 1953, stating that mineral samples from Operation Cascade contained strategic materials of national interest, and recommending the site be secured under federal oversight. The second was a property transfer deed, stamped by several government agencies, conveying the land from Cascade to a private individual named Albert Marsh. The third document was a handwritten letter from Albert Marsh to his son, dated 1967. William, when I'm gone, this land will be yours. I've kept the promise I made back in '53. The government men said certain things needed to stay buried, needed to stay secret. I've honored that, but times change. If you ever decide to look, you'll find what they were so worried about. It's waiting for you. Just be careful who you trust. Cora photographed every page, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Albert Marsh. She'd seen that name in the property records. He owned the land from 1953 until his death in 1985. Then it passed to William Marsh, who sold it to Thomas Hadley in 1997. She closed the files and returned them to the clerk. Then she asked a casual question. Is there still a William Marsh living in the area? The young clerk shrugged. Not that I know of, but you could ask Bill Marsh. He's been a county man forever, knows everyone, usually has lunch at the diner on Main Street, around noon. Cora found him there an hour later. A man in his 70s, lean and weathered, eating a bowl of soup alone at the counter. She introduced herself as the new owner of the old Hadley place and asked if she could join him. He gestured to the stool beside him with the easy politeness of someone who had spent his life in small towns, where strangers were a rarity. You're brave taking on that property, he said, after they'd made small talk about the weather and the road conditions. It's beautiful land, but it has a complicated history. I'm starting to learn that, she said. I found some interesting documents at the courthouse this morning. Cascade Minerals, the mining operations from the 40s. Bill set his spoon down and looked at her more closely. Most people don't dig that deep into the history. I like to know what I'm dealing with, Cora replied. I found a letter from an Albert Marsh to his son William. I assume they're relatives? A long pause hung in the air. Finally, he nodded. William was my father. Albert was my grandfather. The land you live on belonged to our family for 44 years before my father sold it to Tom Hadley. Why did he sell? Bill pushed his bowl away, his appetite apparently gone. My father was a private man. He inherited the property with the intention of building a life there, but he was never comfortable with it. He used to say the land had secrets that troubled him. In 1997, Tom Hadley made him an offer. It wasn't a lot of money, but Dad took it. Said Tom was the kind of man who would know what to do with what was up there. Bill glanced around the diner, checking to see if anyone might be listening. The place was nearly empty, just them and a waitress refilling coffee 2 tables over. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. My grandfather worked for Cascade Minerals back in the early 50s. He was just a laborer at first, but he was smart, and they promoted him to surveyor. That's how he saw what they found. The rare earth deposits were real, valuable even back then. But there was something else. Something in the deep caves that the geologists couldn't explain. My grandfather never told me exactly what it was, but whatever it was, the government got involved. They shut everything down, classified the findings, and paid my grandfather to take the property and keep his mouth shut. He kept quiet for 40 years, but before he died, he told my father the truth. Said it was too important to stay buried forever. My father lived with that knowledge his whole life, not quite sure what to do with it. When Tom Hadley came around asking geological questions, my father saw a chance. He sold him the land cheap and told him just enough to point him in the right direction. Cora absorbed this, fitting it into her timeline. And Tom disappeared 7 years ago. Yes, he did. Bill's expression darkened. 3 months before he vanished, he came to see me. He brought documents, photographs, proof of corporate harassment. He asked me to keep them safe. He said if anything happened to him, I was to give them to someone I trusted, someone who would know what to do with them. Did you keep them? I did. Still have them locked in a safe at my house. They looked at each other across the diner counter with a sense of mutual understanding. Bill saw in her what his father had seen in Hadley, someone who could carry the burden someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated or bought off. The company that was pressuring Tom, Cora said softly. Vanguard Resource Solutions. Are they still active in the area? More than ever, Bill said. They've bought up mineral rights all over the county. But they've never been able to get the one thing they really want. Your land. The piece with the real prize. He pulled out his wallet, took out a business card, and slid it across the counter. His home address was written on the back. Come by tomorrow night. I'll show you what Tom left with me, but you understand, Ms. Finch. Once you've seen it, you're in it. There's no going back to not knowing. She took the card, feeling its weight. I think I'm already in it. That afternoon, driving back to her property, Cora found her truck parked exactly where she'd left it. But something was wrong. All 4 tires had been slashed. Clean, deliberate, thorough cuts. No note, no message. Just damage designed to strand her and send a message. She stared at the ruined tires for a long moment, cold anger rising in her. It was the same tactic they had used on Hadley. Intimidation, escalation, making life difficult until you gave up and sold. But Cora had spent 40 years dealing with hard men in hard country. She knew how to be stubborn. She walked back down to the main road. She flagged down a passing rancher and got a ride into Pine Haven. At the gas station, she arranged for a tow truck and new tires. They were expensive, eating into her meager savings, but necessary. While she waited, she called the sheriff's office and filed a report, knowing it would likely lead nowhere but wanting the documentation. A deputy showed up, looked at the tires, took pictures, and wrote down her statement. He was polite but disinterested, suggesting it was probably kids or hunters who mistook the property for abandoned. Cora didn't argue. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting directly. By the time she got back to the farmhouse with 4 good tires, night was falling over the mountains. She made dinner and sat at the table with Hadley's journal and the documents she'd photographed at the courthouse, arranging them chronologically, building a timeline. 1947. Cascade Minerals discovers valuable deposits and something unusual in the deep caves. 1953. The federal government classifies the findings, shuts down the operation, and transfers the land to Albert Marsh as a caretaker. 1985. Albert dies. The land passes to William Marsh, who lives uneasily with the secret. 1997. William sells to Thomas Hadley, who begins a systematic investigation. 2018. After years of corporate pressure, Hadley disappears. 2025. Cora buys the property. She stared at the pattern. Each owner had carried the burden differently. Albert kept silent. William passed it on. Hadley tried to expose it and was forced into hiding. Now it was her turn, and she had to decide what to do with the knowledge others had killed to suppress. The slashed tires were a warning, but warnings only work on people who can be scared. And Cora Finch, at 62, had learned that the only thing more dangerous than having something to lose was having nothing to lose. She had spent 40 years owning nothing, belonging nowhere. This land was hers. Whatever was buried here, whatever secret had haunted 3 generations, she was going to uncover it. Not for the money, though that mattered, but for the simple, stubborn reason that it was her right to know. The next day, she would go to Bill Marsh's and see what Hadley had left behind. Tonight, she would sleep with her grandfather's old hunting rifle beside the bed, her ears tuned for any sound that didn't belong to the mountain night. She wasn't afraid. She was prepared. There was a difference. and it mattered. The drive to Boise took most of the next morning. Cora had decided she needed proper equipment before exploring any caves or subterranean chambers. Hadley's journal described extensive cave systems, and she was not foolish enough to go in unprepared. The outdoor supply store was staffed by young men who eyed her with poorly disguised skepticism when she asked about caving equipment. But she knew precisely what she needed: a reliable headlamp with spare batteries, proper climbing rope, carabiners, a harness, a helmet, emergency flares, and a first aid kit. She added a better camera and a handheld GPS. The total made her wince, but she paid in cash and left with everything loaded into her truck. On the drive back, she stopped at Bill Marsh's house in Salmon, just as she'd planned. He lived in a modest home on a quiet street, the kind of place that spoke of careful maintenance and limited means. He was waiting for her, opening the door before she could knock. Inside, his house was tidy and simple. Family photographs covered the walls: children, grandchildren, a wife who had passed on, judging by the dates beneath her portrait. Bill led her into a small study and closed the door behind them. From a desk drawer, he retrieved a large manila envelope, worn soft with use. "Tom gave me this back in July of 2018. Said if he ever went missing or turned up dead, I was to give it to whoever bought the property, provided they seemed trustworthy." Cora took the envelope, opening it carefully. Inside were dozens of documents: official geological surveys, lab analysis reports, photos of rock formations and cave systems, and correspondence on Vanguard Resources letterhead. The analysis reports alone were stunning. They confirmed deposits of neodymium, terbium, and dysprosium in commercially viable concentrations. A conservative estimate placed the total value at $11 million. But it was the photographs that captured her attention. They showed subterranean chambers of extraordinary size, million-year-old limestone formations, and, in several images, something else: crystalline structures that didn't look natural. The formations were too regular, too geometric. Tom believed they weren't entirely natural, Bill said, pointing to one photograph. He thought the rare earth concentrations were the result of some kind of meteor impact millions of years ago. The crystal structures were formed under extreme heat and pressure, but he could never prove it without a professional excavation, and he couldn't risk bringing in outsiders. There was more. A 1952 topographical map, marked with handwritten notations, showed cave entrances and underground water flow patterns. One entrance was circled in red ink with a note: "Main access hidden by rockfall, cleared 2001. "Do you know where this entrance is?" Cora asked. Tom marked it on a modern property map. Bill took out another document and spread it on the desk. The entrance was on her land, about a mile east of the farmhouse, in an area of dense forest and limestone outcroppings. He said it was partly hidden by vegetation and debris. You'd have to know what you were looking for. Cora studied the maps, memorizing the landmarks. And Vanguard? What do they know? More than we'd like. They've had people surveying the adjacent properties, probably using ground-penetrating radar and other tech. They know something valuable is there. They just can't get to it without owning your land. He paused. "Miss Finch, these people are dangerous. They've spent years and a lot of money trying to acquire that property. They won't stop just because it's changed hands." "I understand." "Do you?" His expression was grave. Tom Hadley had a paper trail. He had credit cards, bank accounts, a social security number. Yet he managed to disappear so completely, not even the FBI could track him. He did that because he believed his life was in danger. What makes you think you'll fare any better? Because I'm not trying to disappear, she said. I'm trying to bring it all into the light. She gathered the documents, thanked Bill for his trust, and drove back to her property. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the manila envelope rested on the passenger seat, heavy with the secrets she now carried. Back at the farmhouse, she spread everything out across the table and the floor, creating a complete picture of what Hadley had discovered. The geology was clear. A meteor impact millions of years ago had created unusual mineral concentrations and extensive subterranean cave systems. The value was undeniable. Millions of dollars in rare earth elements essential for modern technology. But there was something more in Hadley's notes, something he was reluctant to document clearly. In the margins of several surveys, he'd scrawled questions. How deep? What caused the geometric formations? Explain electromagnetic readings. He had clearly stumbled onto something beyond simple geology, something that raised questions he couldn't answer. Cora spent the rest of the afternoon planning her approach. The next day, she would locate the cave entrance using Hadley's maps and the 1952 survey. She would mark her path, go slowly, document everything. If the chambers were as extensive as the survey suggested, she would need multiple trips to explore them fully. As dusk fell, a vehicle pulled into her drive. Cora watched from the window, her hand on the rifle she now kept close. But it was F.A. Drummond driving her old sedan, carrying another covered dish. Thought you might like some company, Faye said, as Cora opened the door. And I made too much stew. They ate together at the small table, making small talk about the weather turning colder, the roughness of the access road, F.A.'s grown children who lived out of state. But eventually, the conversation turned serious. I heard about your tires, Faye said quietly. Small town. Word gets around. It was a warning, I figured. My husband, Dennis, took money from Vanguard 15 years ago. They wanted information about Tom Hadley, about what he was doing on the property. Dennis worked for the county surveyor's office. He had access to records, maps, survey data. He gave them copies. She looked down at her hands, the guilt plain on her face. We needed the money. Our daughter was sick. The medical bills were crushing us. But Dennis has regretted it every day since. Is he willing to talk about what he gave them? He's dying. Faye's voice was steady but sad. Lung cancer, too far along to treat. But he's made his peace with it. And part of that peace means making things right where he can. If you want to know what Vanguard knows, he'll tell you. He's in hospice care at home now. Probably has another few weeks. Cora reached across the table and squeezed Faye's hand. I'd like to speak with him, whenever it's convenient. Tomorrow afternoon. He's most lucid in the afternoons. They agreed. And after Faye left, Cora sat alone in the growing dark, thinking of the chain of people this land had touched. William Marsh, burdened with inherited knowledge. Thomas Hadley, forced into hiding. Dennis Drummond, compromising his principles and living with regret. And now her, deciding what to do with it all. The land had a way of demanding choices from people. You could walk away, sell out cheap, and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Or you could stand your ground, face whatever came, and accept the consequences. Cora had spent 40 years taking the safe path, the path of least resistance, never staying long enough for the consequences to catch up. She was tired of running. Whatever this land held, whatever dangers it attracted, she was going to see it through. Not out of courage, She didn't feel particularly brave, but out of sheer stubbornness and a deep-seated belief that some things were worth fighting for, even if you'd only just discovered them. The morning dawned cold enough for a frost-laced lawn. Cora dressed in layers, gathered her new equipment, and set out with Hadley's maps and the 1952 survey. The cave entrance was supposed to be a mile to the east, on terrain she hadn't yet explored. The forest in that direction was older, denser. Massive pines blocked out much of the sky, and the ground was a tangle of fallen logs and moss-covered boulders. She walked carefully, checking her GPS coordinates against Hadley's markings, adjusting her path where the terrain forced her to. After 40 minutes, she found the limestone outcropping the survey indicated. It rose 20 feet high, weathered and ancient, draped in places with thick vegetation. She circled it slowly, looking for any sign of an opening on the eastern face, partly hidden by a fallen log and dense undergrowth. She found what she was looking for, a dark opening between the rocks, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Cora cleared away the branches and debris, revealing a gap just large enough to crawl through. A draft of warm air flowed from the opening, the breath of the deep chambers below. She put on her helmet, switched on the headlamp, and tested the batteries. Everything worked. She tied one end of her rope to a sturdy pine, creating an anchor point, and fed the line through the opening as a safety. The entrance passage was tight. She had to crawl on her stomach for 15 feet before it opened up. But then the space expanded dramatically. Her headlamp beam revealed a chamber the size of a small house. Limestone walls glittered with moisture, formations hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. She moved carefully, testing each footstep. The floor sloped downward, and in one corner, a natural passage led deeper. Evidence of previous exploration was everywhere. Old rope fibers tied to rock ledges, the remains of a camp lantern, footprints preserved in the dry mud, just as Hadley's maps had indicated. She descended into a second chamber, then a third. Each was larger than the last, connected by passages that required careful navigation. In the third chamber, she found Hadley's abandoned base camp, a small tent, a folding chair, and a plastic storage container with supplies. The tent was mildewed but intact. Inside the storage container, she found what she'd been hoping for, a geologist's sample bag. The bag held dozens of rock specimens, each carefully tagged with coordinates and dates. Small labels indicated what Hadley had identified: neodymium-rich basalt, terbium oxide concentration, traces of dysprosium, high grade. Each tag also included an estimated value per ton of material. She photographed every sample, every tag. She took out her phone, knowing there was no signal this deep, but stored the images to upload later. The samples alone proved the value of the deposit. With professional extraction and processing, the rare earth elements in these rocks could be worth millions. But it was the last sample that caught her eye. It was different from the others. Crystalline, geometric, almost artificial in its regularity. The tag read, "Unknown formation, magnetic properties, origin uncertain." She held it up to her headlamp, watching the light refract through its structure in unusual patterns. She packed several samples in bags, including the mysterious crystal, and made her way back to the surface. The climb was more difficult than the descent, but she managed it without incident. When she emerged into the daylight, her clothes were filthy and her muscles aching, but she felt triumphant. She now had physical proof, not just documents and theories. Back at the farmhouse, she cleaned up and spent an hour researching rare earth elements on her laptop. What she discovered was sobering. These materials were essential for everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to military defense systems. The vast majority of the world's supply came from China, making domestic sources strategically valuable. A deposit like the one on her property would attract interest far beyond simple corporate greed. That afternoon, she drove to Faye's house as arranged. Dennis Drummond was in a hospital bed set up in the living room, surrounded by medical equipment and photographs of his life. He was thin, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear and sharp. "You're the one who bought Tom's place," he said, as Cora sat by his bed. His voice was raspy but firm. "Faye said you were asking questions. I'm trying to understand what I'm up against." "Smart." He nodded to Faye, who brought a file folder from a desk drawer. "I gave Vanguard copies of the county survey records, property maps, and geological assessment data Tom had filed with the county for permit applications. They paid me $20,000 for information that should have been confidential. I'm not proud of it." "What did they do with the information?" "Used it to map the property remotely, probably with ground-penetrating radar from adjacent land. They know the cave systems exist. They know about the mineral deposits. What they don't know, what Tom was smart enough to never officially document, is exactly where the richest concentrations are, or how to access the deep chambers." Dennis paused to catch his breath, and Faye helped him with his oxygen. When he continued, his voice was lower. "The man who paid me, Randall Kemp, he's not just some corporate lawyer. He's a facilitator. Vanguard calls him when they need problems solved quietly," he said. "He told me that one way or another, Vanguard would acquire that property. He said it was a matter of national strategic interest, that the government would eventually step in on their behalf. I don't know if that was true, or just intimidation." "Did Tom know you betrayed him?" "He eventually found out. He confronted me in 2015. I confessed everything and offered to give the money back. He said it was too late for that, but he didn't hate me for it. He just told me to be careful, that people who dealt with Vanguard had a way of becoming disposable." Dennis looked at Cora with intensity. "Mrs. Finch, I'm telling you this because I owe Tom Hadley an apology I can't deliver in person. If you plan to fight Vanguard, you need to know they've been planning this acquisition for over 20 years. They have resources, connections, and patience, and they have never failed to get what they want." Cora thanked him and left with the folder of documents he had given Vanguard years ago. On the way home, she felt the weight of the accumulated knowledge pressing down on her. Everyone who touched this land was transformed by it, most of them diminished or broken. That night, sitting at her desk with all the evidence spread out before her, Hadley's journals, the assay reports, the samples, Dennis's confession, she made several decisions. First, she would create multiple copies of everything and store them in different locations. Second, she would contact people who could help: environmental lawyers, investigative journalists, academic geologists, who could verify her findings. Third, she would document everything she discovered from this point forward, creating a public record that couldn't be suppressed if something happened to her. She started with the easiest task: sending encrypted emails to 3 different journalists she found through online research. Each email contained a brief summary of the situation and an offer to provide documentation in exchange for a serious investigation. She didn't expect immediate replies, but she had planted seeds that might grow into protection. Next, she called the only family she had left, her niece Stella, in Portland. They weren't close. Cora had always been too transient for real relationships. But Stella was smart and loyal. "Aunt Cora?" Stella answered, surprised. "Is everything okay?" "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully, without asking too many questions just yet." She explained in general terms about the property, the discovery, the corporate pressure, the danger she might be facing. Stella wanted to come immediately, but Cora refused. "I don't want you directly involved in this, but I'm going to send you copies of the documents. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, I need you to make sure those documents get to the authorities and the press. Can you do that?" Stella agreed, her voice tight with concern. "Please be careful." "I'm always careful." After the call, Cora sat in the darkness of her farmhouse, listening to the sounds of the mountain. Tomorrow, she would return to the caves for more exploration. But tonight, she needed to acknowledge what she'd been avoiding. She was genuinely afraid, not of the caves or physical dangers, but of the larger forces aligning against her. Vanguard Resources wasn't just a company. It was an entity with the power to make people disappear, corrupt local officials, and exert pressure through channels she didn't fully understand. But fear, she had learned over 62 years, was just information. It told you the risks, what could be lost. It didn't have to dictate action. She had felt fear before. Fear of hunger in lean times. Fear of winter without proper shelter. Fear of growing old, alone with no savings or security. She had survived all of it through stubbornness and a refusal to quit. This was no different. Now she had something worth protecting, something bigger than herself. That made the fear manageable, almost irrelevant. What mattered was moving forward with her eyes open, understanding the risks, and accepting that some battles choose you, not the other way around. 3 days later, Cora returned to the cave system with better lights and more confidence. She had spent the intervening time studying Hadley's maps in detail, planning her route, and gathering additional supplies. The chambers she had already explored were impressive, but according to Hadley's surveys, they were just the beginning. The deeper chambers remained untouched by her journey so far. She descended through the familiar passages, past Hadley's base camp, and into territory she had not yet mapped. The passages grew tighter here, demanding careful navigation. At one narrow pinch point, she had to take off her pack and push it ahead of her, crawling on her belly. But then the passage opened into a chamber unlike anything she had ever seen. It was enormous. Her headlamp couldn't find the far walls. The ceiling was at least 50 feet high, covered in mineral formations that glittered in her light. And along one wall, tucked into a natural alcove, she found something unexpected, a more recent campsite. This was not the long-abandoned base camp she'd found before. This site showed signs of recent use: a modern sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern that still had a charge, and a small camp stove. Most importantly, there was a rugged plastic case of the type used to protect sensitive equipment. Cora approached cautiously, her instincts on high alert for any sign that she wasn't alone. But the chamber was silent, except for the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. She opened the case with slightly trembling hands. Inside was a sealed, waterproof container, and within it, a letter and a USB drive. The letter was handwritten on lined paper, dated just 2 months ago, July 2025. It began, "To whoever finds this, if you are reading this letter, it means you bought my property and were brave or curious enough to explore. My name is Thomas Hadley, and I am writing to you from a small town in New Mexico. where I have been living under a false name for the past 7 years. Cora sat down on a flat rock, holding the letter close to her headlamp, reading with growing astonishment. I did not die, and I did not simply disappear. I staged my disappearance deliberately after Vanguard Resources made it clear they would stop at nothing to acquire my property. The final straw was when they sabotaged the brakes on my truck. I survived by luck and realized that being Thomas Hadley had become too dangerous. I had been planning an exit strategy for months. I had money stashed away, documents prepared, and contacts who could help me establish a new identity. The night I vanished, I deliberately left everything behind: my truck, my personal belongings, enough evidence to suggest an accident or a voluntary disappearance, but nothing definitive. Then I walked off my property and never looked back. What I discovered on this land goes beyond simple geology. Yes, there are rare earth deposits worth an estimated $11 million by conservative estimates. But the real value, and the real danger, comes from something I was never able to document or fully understand. The crystalline formations in the deeper chambers exhibit properties that defy conventional geological explanation. They are not just valuable minerals, they are something unprecedented. I sent samples to 3 different labs under false names. All 3 came back with similar conclusions. The crystals contain rare earth elements in concentrations and combinations that should not naturally exist on the Earth's surface. The best explanation, and this is speculation, is that they are the result of a meteor impact millions of years ago, but not from an ordinary space rock. The crystal structures suggest formation under conditions of extreme heat, pressure, and possibly electromagnetic forces I cannot adequately explain. Vanguard Resources knows about the rare earth deposits. That is public geology documented in county records. What they do not know, what I never officially documented, is the full extent of the deeper chambers and what lies within them. The USB drive I've included contains full geological surveys, lab reports, and most importantly, evidence of Vanguard's illegal activities. I have documented years of harassment, intimidation, bribery attempts, and threats. I have recordings, emails, photographs, and witness statements from people they corrupted or threatened. This evidence could shut down their operations and lead to criminal charges against several executives, including their head of acquisitions, Brendan Kemp. I was waiting for the right time to expose all of this, but that time never came. I grew comfortable in my new life and became cautious. The truth is, I am afraid of what Vanguard might do if I resurface. So, I am placing this burden on you, whoever you are. You have several options. The easiest is to sell the property for a lowball price to Vanguard and walk away with enough money to live comfortably. They will pay you well for your silence, and you will avoid the trouble I faced. Or, you can fight. Use the evidence I've provided to expose them, protect the land, and potentially benefit from its resources in a legal and controlled way. If you decide to fight, contact the people listed in the encrypted files on this USB drive. There is an environmental lawyer in Seattle who specializes in mineral rights cases, an investigative journalist who has been tracking Vanguard for years, and a former USGS geologist who can confirm my findings. Together, they can help you navigate this mess. One last piece of information that may shock you. I chose you specifically. When I learned the county was seizing my property for back taxes and planning to auction it, I had a friend in the assessor's office arrange for a specific type of listing. $1 as is with minimal publicity. Then I had another friend monitor who showed interest. When your name came up and I researched your background, I saw someone with the qualities I had hoped for: independence, resilience, honesty, and most importantly, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain. I am sorry to have placed this burden on you without your knowledge or consent, but I sincerely believe you are capable of handling what I could not. The land deserves someone who will protect it, not exploit it carelessly. And the truth about Vanguard's activities deserves to come to light. If you decide to contact me, there is an encrypted email address in the USB files. I will respond, though it may take time. If you decide to sell and walk away, I completely understand. This was never your fight, and you are under no obligation to carry my burden. Whatever you decide, know that you were not chosen randomly. You were chosen carefully, with hope and faith that you would do what is right. Good luck, and I'm sorry I wasn't braver 7 years ago. Thomas Hadley. Cora read the letter twice, her emotions swinging between shock, anger, and a reluctant respect. Hadley had manipulated her, but with a purpose. He had put her in danger, but he had also given her the tools to fight back. Most importantly, he had been honest about his own limitations and fears. The flash drive would hold the evidence he promised. She would verify that when she got to a computer. But the revelation that changed everything was simple. This was not random. She had not stumbled into this situation by luck or chance. She had been selected, vetted, and deliberately placed here by someone who decided she was capable of finishing what he had started. That should have made her angry, and a part of her was. But another part, the part shaped by 40 years of working the land and reading people, understood. Hadley had seen in her what she tried to see in herself, someone who could stand her ground when it mattered. She packed away the letter and the USB drive, taking one last look around the massive chamber. Somewhere in that darkness were the crystal formations Hadley had described, the mysterious geological anomalies worth more than anyone had yet calculated. Tomorrow she would return with better equipment and document everything. Tonight, she needed to get back to her farmhouse, secure these documents, and decide her next move. The climb out of the cave felt faster, fueled by adrenaline and purpose. When she emerged into the late afternoon sun, her mind was already working through options and strategies. She was not a pawn in someone else's game. She was a player who had just been told the real rules. Hadley had given her weapons, evidence, contacts, and the truth of what she was facing. Now she had to decide how to use them. The easy path, selling to Vanguard and walking away rich, held no appeal. She had spent 40 years taking easy paths, and they had led her to age 62 with nothing but a pack on her back. This land, these secrets, this fight, it was hers now. Not because she had sought it out, but because it had found her. Or rather, because someone had decided she was the right person to find it. She could either honor that trust or betray it. The choice was simple, even if the consequences were not. Cora spent that night at her kitchen table with her laptop, the USB drive plugged in, working through Hadley's files by lamplight. The drive was encrypted, but he had included the password in the letter. Inside were hundreds of documents, photographs, audio recordings, and video files. Years of accumulated evidence arranged in neat folders. The geological surveys were professional and comprehensive. Hadley had documented every chamber, every passage, every mineral concentration with scientific precision. His estimates of the rare earth deposits were conservative, but substantial. $11 million was based solely on current market prices and easily accessible veins. If the deeper formations proved equally rich, the value could soar to 15, even 18 million. But it was the evidence against Vanguard Resources that truly seized her attention. Hadley had recorded phone conversations where Randall Camp made veiled threats. He had photographed suspicious vehicles surveilling his property. He had emails documenting bribes paid to county officials and attempts to manipulate zoning regulations. Most damning of all were the bank records, a trail of corruption stretching back for years, showing payments from Vanguard shell companies to men like Dennis Drummond. There was also a list of contacts, just as he had promised. An environmental lawyer in Seattle named Sarah Brennan, who specialized in mineral rights disputes. An investigative journalist, Marcus Webb, who had written extensively on corporate malfeasance in resource extraction. And a retired USGS geologist, Dr. Patricia Oakes, who could verify Hadley's findings. Cora stared at the names for a long time, understanding that to contact them was to commit herself fully to this fight. There would be no turning back to anonymity, no retreat to safety. But she had already made her decision in the cave, the moment she read Hadley's letter. She drafted careful emails to all three, using the encrypted communication method Hadley had set up. She explained who she was, how she had come to own the property, what she had discovered, and what she needed. From Sarah Brennan, legal protection and counsel. From Marcus Webb, investigation and public exposure. From Dr. Oakes, scientific verification and credibility. She sent the emails at 2 a.m. and crawled into bed, the USB drive tucked safely in her backpack. Sleep came in fragments, fractured by the sounds of the mountain night and her own restless thoughts. The morning brought answers. All three had replied within hours, their messages urgent and engaged. Sarah Brennan offered an immediate phone consultation. Marcus Webb wanted to visit the property later that week. Dr. Oakes requested copies of the geological data, promising a rapid analysis. But the morning brought something else, too. Cora was making coffee when she noticed the footprints, fresh impressions in the frost-covered grass just outside her window, leading from the tree line to her farmhouse, and back again. Someone had been watching her during the night. Someone had come close enough to peer through her windows. She followed the tracks to where they vanished into the forest, finding discarded cigarette butts and scuffed earth where someone had stood for a long time. The surveillance had escalated. They were no longer just watching from a distance. They were getting bold. Cora went back inside and immediately copied everything from the drive onto separate thumb drives she'd bought in Boise. One she mailed to Stella with explicit instructions. Another she gave to Faye Drummond, who stopped by mid-morning with genuine concern etched on her face. "Dennis passed last night," Faye told her, her voice low, peacefully, in his sleep. "But before he went, he made me promise I'd look out for you. He said you were heading down the same dangerous road Tom Hadley did." Cora hugged her, feeling the weight of Dennis's final act of conscience. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Don't be." He was ready and at peace. Faye held Cora's shoulders. "But you need to understand something. Vanguard knows you're not just some simple buyer. They've seen you exploring, researching. They know you're onto something. It's only a matter of time before they make a direct move. Let them come." "That's brave talk. But Cora, these people don't play fair." "Neither do I," Cora said, "when it matters." After Faye left, Cora spent the afternoon preparing. She formally contacted the sheriff's office, filing reports on the surveillance and trespassing, knowing it would create a paper trail even if they did nothing. She photographed everything, the footprints, the cigarette butts, the tire tracks where vehicles had parked on the logging road. Then she called Marcus Webb directly. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the intensity of someone always chasing a story. "Miss Finch, I've been waiting for someone to contact me about that property. I've been tracking Vanguard's activities in Idaho for 3 years, but I've never had an inside source." "I have proof," Cora said. "Recordings, documents, bank records showing bribery and corruption. But I need your help to get it out there, in a way that protects me and ensures the story isn't buried." "When can I come?" 3 days. I need time to fully document the cave system first. Bring professional camera equipment if you can. I want everything on high-definition video. They set a date and time, discussing logistics and security protocols. Marcus would arrive with a documentarian he trusted, and they would spend 2 days gathering footage and interviews. The story would be released simultaneously in print and video, making it harder to suppress. Next, she spoke with Sarah Brennan, the environmental lawyer. Sarah was just as eager, but more cautious. "What you're describing is a textbook case of corporate harassment on a valuable claim. This is actionable. But Ms. Finch, I have to be honest. Taking on a company like Vanguard requires resources. They will bury us in legal motions, appeals, and delays. Do you have the funds for a protracted legal battle?" "I have enough, and I have evidence that might shorten the battle considerably. Send me copies of everything. I'll start building the case. We need to establish your clear ownership, document all harassment, and file for restraining orders before they try anything more aggressive. I can have the preliminary paperwork ready in 48 hours. The call with Dr. Oakes was the most technical. She had reviewed the geological data Cora sent and responded with a scientific excitement barely contained by professional restraint. "If these surveys are correct, and I have no reason to doubt Thomas Hadley's work, you are sitting on one of the most significant rare earth deposits discovered in the continental United States in the last 30 years. The strategic implications alone are enormous. Every major tech company and defense contractor in the country would have an interest in securing that supply." "And the crystal formations?" Hadley mentioned ones he couldn't explain. Dr. Oakes paused. "I would need to see them in person to say for sure, but based on his descriptions and lab readouts, they sound like impactites, rocks formed by the extreme conditions of a meteor impact. If they contain the concentrations of rare earths he documented, formed by extraterrestrial processes, that is truly unprecedented. Which means even more pressure on me to give up the land." "Exactly. Ms. Finch, you need scientific, legal, and possibly physical protection. Would you be willing to host a team to document everything under controlled conditions? With proper credentials and public observation, it becomes much harder for private interests to suppress the findings." Cora agreed, setting a timeline. 3 days for her final solo exploration and documentation. Then Marcus Webb's visit, followed by a scientific team led by Dr. Oakes. Each step would increase public awareness and diminish Vanguard's ability to act with impunity. But between the phone calls and the rising sense of momentum, something else happened. A vehicle pulled into her driveway late that afternoon. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows. Cora watched from her window, her shotgun within reach, as a man in an expensive suit stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of easy confidence that comes from rarely being told no. He knocked politely on the door. When Cora answered, the shotgun visible behind her, he simply smiled. "Ms. Finch, my name is Brandon Camp with Vanguard Resource Solutions. I was hoping we could talk." About what? About your property. About options that could be mutually beneficial. May I come in? I promise it will be worth your time. Against her better judgment, or perhaps because she wanted to see what he would offer, Cora let him in. He sat at her kitchen table, declined coffee, and looked around the modest farmhouse with an undisguised appraisal. You've been doing some research, he said, nodding toward the maps and papers she hadn't fully hidden. Found some interesting things, I imagine. Thomas Hadley was thorough before his unfortunate disappearance. What do you want, Mr. Camp? To make you a straightforward offer. $250,000. Cash. We close immediately. You walk away with enough money to buy a nice place wherever you want. And we acquire a property that is of strategic interest to our operations. Everybody wins. And if I refuse? His smile hardened slightly. Ms. Finch, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen how these situations play out. You're a practical woman. I can see that. You've worked hard your whole life. You've probably never had much financial security. This property is remote, demanding, and frankly, more trouble than it's worth for someone in your position. Take the money. Make your life easy. The answer is no. Be certain before you refuse. Our offer is generous now, but it will not remain generous if complications arise. Property disputes can be lengthy and expensive. Environmental assessments can take years. Title challenges can emerge. Why go through that stress when you can be comfortable? Cora stood and opened the front door. I think we're done here. Camp rose slowly, his expression shifting to something colder. I tried to be reasonable. I made a fair offer. But understand this. Vanguard has invested considerable resources in securing access to this land. We are not going to walk away because one stubborn woman thinks she can stand in the way of institutional interests. You will sell, Ms. Finch. The only question is whether you do it now, on favorable terms, or later, after we have exhausted every legal avenue and your life has become significantly more difficult. Get off my property. He left without another word, but his SUV remained at the end of her driveway for a full 20 minutes, before finally disappearing down the mountain road. Cora watched until the dust settled, understanding that the pretense of civility was over. Vanguard didn't just know she was some random buyer. They knew she was investigating, documenting, and preparing to fight. That night, Cora did something she hadn't done in years. She prayed. Not to any specific deity, she'd never been particularly religious, but to the land itself, to whatever spirits or forces governed the mountains. She asked for strength, for wisdom, for protection. And then she loaded her shotgun, set it beside her bed, and slept with the kind of determined exhaustion that comes from knowing a storm is on the horizon, and there is nothing to do but stand your ground and wait for it to break. The next day, she would go back into the caves one last time, document everything she could find, and bring back samples for Dr. Oakes. Then Marcus Webb would arrive, and the process of going public would begin. Once the story was out, once the evidence was distributed and verified, Vanguard's power to act against her would diminish. Public attention was protection. Transparency was armor. She just had to survive long enough to get there. Dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of mountain morning that made everything feel sharp and immediate. Cora had been up before sunrise, preparing for what she knew would be her last solo exploration of the caves. Marcus Webb would arrive tomorrow with his film crew, and after that, the place would never again be private or quiet. She packed carefully. Professional camera gear she'd rented in Boise, sample bags, measuring tools, and the GPS unit that would create precise coordinates for every significant discovery. This time, she wanted documentation that would stand up to scientific scrutiny. Marcus called her just after breakfast. "Ms. Finch, I'm bringing a professional surveyor with me tomorrow, a man named Mark Coulson. He has experience with cave systems and the equipment to create detailed 3D maps of the chambers. With your permission, we'd like to document everything thoroughly." She agreed immediately, relieved to have expert help on the way. But it also meant that today was her last chance to experience the caves on her own, before they became public record and an object of scientific curiosity. The hike to the cave entrance felt different this time. She was no longer exploring the unknown. She was saying goodbye to a secret she had held for a very short time. The forest was quiet, filled only with the call of birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. She entered the caves with practiced confidence, moving down through familiar passages to Hadley's base camp and beyond. Her destination was the massive chamber where she had found his letter, and more importantly, the deeper passages that led to the crystalline formations he had described, but she had not yet fully explored. The tunnels beyond the great chamber were narrower, requiring careful navigation. She marked her path with glow sticks, ensuring she could find her way back. After 20 minutes of steady descent, the passage opened into something extraordinary. The chamber was smaller than the one above, but it was filled with formations unlike anything she had ever seen. Crystalline structures rose from the floor and hung from the ceiling, not stalactites or stalagmites, but perfect geometric forms that caught the beam of her headlamp, fracturing it into a cascade of prismatic patterns. The formations were regular, almost architectural, as if deliberately arranged by an unseen hand. Cora moved slowly, her camera recording every detail. The crystals were embedded in the limestone walls, concentrations of minerals that seemed to glow with an inner light. She reached out and touched one. It was cool and smooth, its surface like polished glass. When she tapped it with her knuckle, it produced a clear, bell-like tone that resonated through the chamber. For an hour, she documented everything. Photographs from every conceivable angle, sweeping video pans, precise measurements of the formations, and GPS coordinates for each significant structure. She collected samples with meticulous care, breaking off small fragments and sealing them in labeled bags. Dr. Oakes would analyze them and confirm what Hadley had long suspected. These were no ordinary geological formations. As she worked, she felt a strange sense of connection to this place. These chambers had existed in darkness for millions of years, shaped by forces beyond human comprehension. Hadley had found them, recognized their importance, and now she was continuing his work, bringing them into the light. She was packing her samples, her documentation complete, when a sound made her freeze. Voices, distant but clear, echoing through the passages. Someone else was in the cave system. Cora instantly switched off her headlamp, plunging the chamber into a dim glow lit only by the faint luminescence of her trail markers. She moved silently back toward the passage entrance, listening. 3 men, maybe 4. Their conversation was carried by the tunnel acoustics. "How much further? We've been walking for 30 minutes, one complained. "Keep moving," another voice commanded. "We need samples and photos before the property is legally locked down. Once that lawyer files the injunction, we won't get another chance." Cora's pulse hammered against her ribs. Vanguard. They had sent a team into her caves, trespassing, stealing, trying to document the very thing she was fighting to protect. They knew she was building a case and were racing to establish a counterclaim. She retreated into the crystal chamber, her eyes scanning for an alternate exit. Hadley's maps had shown several passages, but she hadn't explored them all yet. In the farthest corner, tucked behind the largest crystalline spire, she found it, a narrow opening that seemed to lead deeper into the earth. She squeezed through, pushing her pack ahead of her, and found herself in a natural chimney, a vertical shaft with just enough handholds to allow for a careful descent. Below, she could see another, smaller chamber, with what looked like a horizontal passage leading away from it. Behind her, the voices grew louder. Jesus, look at these formations. Get the camera on this. This proves the value of the deposit. Cora moved down the chimney, her movements quick but sure. Years of ranch work had given her an instinct for climbing, for finding purchase where none seemed to exist. She dropped the last 6 feet, landing in a crouch, and immediately slipped into the horizontal passage. It was tight. She had to crawl in places, but it led steadily onward, and more importantly, away from the intruders. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 15 minutes, she saw a glimmer of light ahead. Natural light. The passage emerged onto the eastern face of a limestone cliff she had noted during her surveys, but had never approached from this angle. It was shielded by vegetation, nearly impossible to spot unless you knew precisely where to look. A hidden, natural escape route. Hadley must have found it too. She carefully descended the cliff face, using exposed roots and rock ledges for support. She came out about a half-mile from her house, approaching it from an unfamiliar direction. The forest provided cover as she made her way home. Inside, she immediately called Marcus Webb. "We have a problem. Vanguard sent a team into the caves. They're in there right now, documenting everything, probably trying to establish a prior claim or gather evidence they can use against us." Marcus was silent for a moment. "Cora, that's actually good news. They're trespassing on private property and stealing geological samples. If we can prove they're down there, it's evidence of corporate malfeasance. Do you have security cameras?" "No, but I know where their vehicle has to be parked. The only access point is near the cave entrance. Get photos if you can do it safely. License plates, faces, anything identifiable. I'm leaving Seattle now. I'll be there tonight instead of tomorrow. We need to document this while it's happening." Cora grabbed her camera and slipped back into the woods, approaching the cave entrance from a concealed position. As expected, 2 vehicles were parked on her property near the access trail, a dark blue pickup and a gray SUV. She photographed them from several angles, getting clear shots of the license plates and the corporate logos on the equipment visible through the windows. Then she waited. The men emerged from the caves, 3 of them, carrying sample bags and professional photography gear. She filmed them as they loaded their vehicles and drove off, capturing sharp images of their faces and confirming their vehicle IDs. As soon as they were gone, she returned to the farmhouse and sent everything to Marcus Webb, Sarah Brennan, and Dr. Oakes. The proof of their trespass was now documented and distributed. Vanguard's aggressive move had backfired. They had just handed her the evidence she needed. That evening, as the setting sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and violet, Cora sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, feeling the weight of what was to come. The next day, Marcus would arrive with his team. The documentation would begin in earnest. The story would begin to take shape, a story of corporate greed, illegal intimidation, and one woman's refusal to be driven off land that was rightfully hers. She had spent 40 years living in other people's spaces, never truly claiming anything as her own. But this land, these caves, this fight, this was hers, and she would defend it with everything she had. Marcus Webb arrived just after dark, driving a rental SUV loaded with camera gear, accompanied by a fellow surveyor and a documentarian named Rachel Chen. They were professional and focused, understanding that time was of the essence. "We'll document everything tonight and tomorrow," Marcus explained as they unloaded their equipment. "Video interviews with you, footage of the trespassing evidence, shots of the property. Then at dawn tomorrow, we go into the caves with proper lighting and gear. By tomorrow night, I'll have enough for a written report and a short documentary. Releasing it simultaneously across multiple platforms makes it harder to suppress." They worked through the night. Cora gave an on-camera interview, detailing everything: how she acquired the property, what she'd discovered, the harassment she'd faced, and the evidence of Vanguard's illegal activities. Rachel filmed B-roll of the property: the barn where she'd found Hadley's compass, the interior of the farmhouse that told the story of a hard-working woman making her stand. They met Don at the cave entrance at first light. Marcus and his surveyor were laden with professional equipment, while Rachel operated a high-end camera rig. Cora led them through the passages she now knew so well, pointing out features and explaining what Hadley's surveys had documented. In the crystal chamber, Marcus's surveyor, a quiet man named David Park, set up laser scanning equipment that created detailed 3D models of the space. Rachel filmed it all as Marcus took photos and measurements. They collected samples, following Dr. Oakes's protocols, and documented the geometric formations that defied conventional explanation. "This is extraordinary," David said, peering at the crystals through a specialized lens. "I've surveyed caves on 3 continents, and I've never seen natural formations like these. The regularity, the composition, it's remarkable." They spent 4 hours underground, documenting every significant chamber and passage. By the time they emerged, all 3 visitors were transformed by what they'd seen, buzzing with the excitement of journalists and scientists who have found something genuinely new. Back at the farmhouse, as Marcus and Rachel began processing the footage, Cora received a call from Sarah Brennan. "I'm filing for the injunctions this afternoon," Sarah said. "Based on the trespassing evidence you provided, I can establish immediate grounds for legal action. More importantly, I'm filing a formal complaint with state and federal authorities regarding Vanguard's activities. The evidence Thomas Hadley collected is enough to warrant a criminal investigation." "How long until they respond?" Cora asked. "They'll know about the filings within hours. Expect them to try and negotiate first. A better settlement offer, promises of legal protection. When that fails, they'll likely resort to more aggressive tactics. But you did something smart. You made this public before they could isolate you. That's your best protection." Late that afternoon, as Marcus was editing his initial report, 3 vehicles drove up the long driveway: 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs and Randall Kemp's black sedan. Cora watched them approach, with Marcus and Rachel standing beside her, cameras ready. Sheriff Tom Bradley got out first, a man in his 50s who looked deeply uncomfortable with whatever had brought him here. Kemp emerged from his vehicle with 2 other men in suits, his expression a mask of grim determination. "Ms. Finch," the sheriff began, "we've received complaints of trespassing and harassment. We need to ask you a few questions." Kemp stepped forward. "Complaints from Vanguard Resource Solutions. Your cameras were on our property yesterday, photographing our employees. That is illegal surveillance and harassment." Marcus raised his own camera, filming the exchange. "Marcus Webb, investigative journalist. For the record, Are you stating that Vanguard employees were on Ms. Finch's property yesterday? Kemp's expression flickered with recognition and annoyance. We were conducting legitimate survey work on adjacent property with the proper permits. These photographs clearly show your vehicles and personnel on Ms. Finch's property, Marcus countered, near the entrance to a cave system that lies entirely within her property boundaries. That is criminal trespass. Furthermore, I have documentation of years of harassment, intimidation, and illegal activities by Vanguard against multiple landowners. Those documents were filed with state and federal authorities this afternoon. The sheriff looked from Marcus to Kemp, clearly reassessing the situation. Mr. Kemp, do you have documentation proving you had permission to access Ms. Finch's land? This is a misunderstanding. Do you have written permission? The sheriff insisted. Kemp's jaw tightened. We were under the impression that certain areas were part of Federal Forest Service land. My property lines are clearly established in the county records, Cora said calmly. And you've been aware of those boundaries since you first approached Thomas Hadley about buying this land 15 years ago. This isn't a misunderstanding, Mr. Kemp. It's deliberate trespass. Rachel kept filming as the sheriff pulled Kemp aside for a private conversation. Marcus used the opportunity to brief the deputies on the evidence they had collected, showing them the photographs and explaining the context of the corporate harassment. When Sheriff Bradley returned, his demeanor had shifted. Ms. Finch, I'm going to need copies of your trespassing evidence. Mr. Kemp, you'll need to come to my office tomorrow to give a formal statement. From what I'm seeing here, there are serious questions that need answering. Kemp shot Cora a look of barely contained fury. This isn't over. You're making a grave mistake. No, Cora said, her voice steady. The mistake was yours. You thought you could bully me the way you bullied Thomas Hadley. But I'm not alone and I'm not hiding. Everything you've done is documented. Everything you've tried is now public knowledge. You wanted this property so badly you were willing to break the law. Now you're going to face the consequences. Kemp left without another word, his car kicking up dust as it sped down the mountain road. The sheriff stayed longer, collecting statements and evidence, his attitude shifting from skepticism to genuine concern as the full picture came into focus. After they had all finally gone, Cora, Marcus, and Rachel sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the last of the sun dip below the mountains.